Narrative research design is a form of qualitative research where the researchers analyze their subjects' lived experiences through things like autobiographies, journals, interviews, letters, and photos to gain knowledge and understanding in a specific field. There is evidence that narrative research has been used since at least the 1980s. It was John Dewey's theory of experience that provided the philosophical roots for narrative research. Since Michael Connolly and D. Jean Clandinin wrote an article which introduced narrative inquiry to educational researchers in 1990, researchers have been increasingly using this methodology. Catherine Kohler-Reisman introduced what she called the narrative turn, meaning the methodology could be used in any human science field to avoid this research being used primarily for only one field of study. In 1993, Martin Cortazzi suggested three factors to explain why the use of narrative research had been growing. The first thing he mentioned was the increased emphasis on teacher reflections. The second thing he mentioned was more emphasis being placed on teachers' knowledge about what they know, how they think, their professional development, and their decision-making process in the classroom. The last thing he mentioned was educators seeking to empower each other by discussing their experiences. Cheryl Craig is a great example of educators empowering one another by encouraging the discussion of their experience in the classroom. In 2009, Cheryl Craig presented teachers' lived experiences at Yeager School during a 3-year period of reform. A special interest group was formed by the American Educational Research Association to create an ongoing discussion about narrative research. Many social scientists in other fields have also been offering procedural guidance for narrative reports as a form of qualitative research since the mid-1990s to the early 2000s. As you can see from the list on this slide, there are many different types of narrative research. Some narrative research is written by the subject themselves, while other narrative research is written by the researcher. Narrative forms can be combined as well. For example, a study about teachers can be a biography because it was written by the researchers, but it still focuses on the life experiences of the teacher. The researcher may also decide to use a theoretical perspective in their narrative report that relates to the individual they are studying, choosing a feminist perspective while doing a study on female teachers, for example.
Here are some of the key characteristics of narrative research. Narrative research is meant to explore a research problem by understanding the experiences of an individual. Some key characteristics include a timeline of experience from the past, present, and potential future ones, first-person life stories, actions obtained through field texts, restoring or retelling an individual's stories, incorporating context of where the experiences took place, and a collaboration between the researcher and participants in the study. Here are some ethical issues that may be encountered when conducting a narrative research study. When collecting stories, research participants may fake the data or not tell the full story. Participants may also not be able to share the real story for legal reasons. For example, this could be a Holocaust victim or a domestic abuse victim. Them not being able to tell the full story may therefore cause distortion in the story or the research. This can cause participants to become vulnerable also because when the study is concluded, it can cause conflicts between other people involved in the story or other people with a different side to the story. There could just be a number of conflicts that could be inflicted on the participant. Some other ethical issues that may arise with this research design are stories can contain biases. Also, it is a question of who owns the story that the participant is telling. They may be telling it from their point of view, but there's always two sides to every story. Therefore, if there's someone who owns the original quote version of the story, does the researcher have permission to use this story? Even though the participant may grant permission, there might be other people who are not happy with it. Participants may also lose their voice in the retelling of the story. For example, like the game Telephone, when you tell one person something and then it gets distorted to something else, the original person's voice gets lost, which can happen when using this research method. And lastly, is the gain of the researcher more important than the participant? So when a researcher is using another person's story, is this going to negatively impact the participant, positively impact the participant? It's something that must be considered when using this method. Here are the steps to conducting a narrative research study. First, the researcher must find an educational problem to explore. Then, they must select an individual or individuals with insight on the problem or personal experiences on the problem. 3, they must collect stories from the individual that reflect the personal experiences, have them share their story in detail, and then collect other relevant texts on the topic. Number 4, retell the individual story. Build in past, present, and future experiences. Add context like a location or how, when, who, where the story happened. Describe the story, and then analyze the story. Step 5, include and collaborate with participants throughout all research. This step is step 5, but it should be included throughout the whole thing. It shouldn't just be a step 5. Like, participants should always be involved and aware of everything that's happening with their story and their information. Number 6, write a story about the participants' personal and social experiences. And 7, validate the accuracy of all gathered information. Here are some appropriate sampling techniques for the narrative design of research. For this design, you must find people with meaningful information on the selected research problem. Ensure a reasonably small amount of people are selected to participate, otherwise it can cause cloudiness within the research or confusion. It is important to ask open-ended questions to the participants to ensure non-biased answers and ensure participants are aware of what is required of them and if they are willing 100% to participate. Here are some of the inappropriate sampling techniques for the narrative research design. Using a large amount of participants. This can lessen the quality of research and cause cloudiness. The more people being interviewed, the more hard it is to analyze the data and their stories effectively without losing the original participant's voice. Selecting an irrelevant group to sample. So participants who are uneducated on the topic or do not have first-hand experiences would be irrelevant research and would not be helpful to the research problem. And lastly, not informing participants of what is required of them or not gaining proper consent. This is also an ethical issue, and it is always important to make sure that participants are aware of everything that they will need to do, what is being done with their information, and the possible risks of the research. Here is an example of a narrative research study done in 2020 on child labor in a city in Iran. This study was done to investigate the growing issue of child labor in Iran. The researchers started by gathering files on 345 exploited children, then narrowed it down to 15 children whom they interviewed. The goal was to determine the reasoning for the growing amount of exploited children in Iran. Here is just a breakdown of the procedure of this narrative study example. After identifying the educational problem of child labor in Iran, the authors began step 3 of the narrative research process. The authors reviewed relevant files on the topic, then purposely selected 15 individuals to collect their experiences and family backgrounds on the issue. The study then enters step 4, where the authors retell and summarize the interviews done by the children. The data from the interviews is then analyzed, and the similarities and differences are recorded, which is part of step 6. To further explain this research process, here are the results and the conclusion of the study we used. The results of this narrative study concluded that most children came from a home of poverty, most children came from a home where domestic violence was present, most children had parents who are financially struggling, some even admitted that their parents encouraged them to enter the workforce at a young age, and all had no access to education. The conclusion of this article was, the authors therefore said the reason for so many children being in the workforce is due to family influence and high levels of family poverty, and this created the commonly held notion that it is normal for children to work at a young age in Iran, regardless of the dangers and safety issues with them joining the workforce. So basically this study just breaks down the research process of a narrative design. First, the authors collected their participants that were relevant to the topic. They then interviewed the relevant people to collect their stories. They then analyzed and deepened understanding of these issues, analyzed this data, and came up with their conclusion, which is what we just discussed.